What's going on, y'all? Live from an undisclosed location, pre-recorded from an undisclosed location, I should say. Let's take a look at the upcoming cards in the Spotlight caches, because I've heard a lot of discourse around these related to, wow, these aren't really all that good, and these are cards people are very excited for in the next upcoming season that are going to be paired with some cards that I've been hearing are not that good. So let's take a look at it. First up in the first Spotlight cache of Marvel Rivals season is Luna Snow. Luna Snow is a 3/5 that adds an ice cube to both your and your opponent's side of the board. Each ice cube gives the respective player +1 energy and is destroyed when the location is filled, checking at the beginning of the turn. This is an interesting dynamic to create. On the one hand, this card reminds me a lot of Wave, symmetrical 3/5 ramp tool that you're really only utilizing to do something truly unfair, like ramping out a Thanos on turn 3 or galactusing people. It's really sort of hyper specialized combo decks. But on the other hand, this card also reminds me a little bit of Wiccan, where this is a card that can allow you to do things earlier on a consistent basis without paying a massive cost, as long as your deck is set up better than your opponent's deck to take advantage of that. One card that I think really highlights this to me is the recent release of Gore the God Butcher, who is best used if you can get him out early in concert with a Mystique. That kind of power spike can only really happen if you are cheating him in terms of energy, with Anti-Venom, Hope Summers, and other cards of that nature being important pieces of most Gore decks. So the real thing I'm trying to get at here is if this card is going to be good, it'll be in concert with other things of that nature, cards that are much better and are expensive, but they're much better when they're played before turn 6. Big, beefy 6-drops also count, but it might not be better than Wiccan at doing that. But what I'm trying to figure out when I talk about how this card is going to land is whether there's going to be a good home for it, a la the Gore stuff, or whether it's going to be a generic card along the lines of Wiccan, or a specific card along the lines of Wave. This is an interesting card with a powerful stat line and an interesting effect, and I think it has the chance to hit as high as Wiccan did. And I will say a lot of people were down on Wiccan before it came out. This is the kind of card that has hit high recently. Good stats, ability to ramp, deck building ways to make it matter more for you than for your opponent. As long as your energy is more impactful than your opponent's energy, this is not actually going to be a symmetrical effect. This card is powerful, I think, and will be a reason to look at opening Spotlight caches at the very least in this week. Alongside Luna Snow in the caches are two interesting cards, both of which seem to imply she might be supposed to go in some decks that I don't think she's actually supposed to go into. The first of these is Lady Deathstrike, who is, I would describe her as fringe playable. You're not going to be upset to own her, but you're also not going to be required to own her. The times when she's good typically correlates with a rise in cards like Luke Cage and Mobius and Mobius, but we're currently in one of those metas and she hasn't really seemed to make a dent in it. It's possible everyone is simply missing that, but it's also possible that even though she is good, she's not good enough as a consistent answer to that stuff to be good outside of those specific matchups, and so she often ends up getting cut in favor of cards that are generically strong. She's been in and out of various decks, typically in sort of response to Mobius and Luke Cage. Those are the cards that she is usually utilized best against, but she has some reasonable upside. This is not a card you're going to be upset to have in your collection, but it's also probably not a card that you're going to want to go out of your way to acquire. It's on the sort of lower end of power at this range of Series 4 and 5. It is one of those cards that I would keep an eye out on for dropping, just because of the previous patterns of cards they've dropped into Series 4 and 5, dropped out of Series 4 and 5, I should say. It's something to keep an eye on when it comes to this card specifically, because she hasn't really demonstrated the sort of universal playability of some cards that I kind of expect to stay in Series 5 forever, like Jeff. X-23 is the other card in the caches alongside Luna Snow and Lady Deathstrike, making up the third member of this femme fatale trio, and I think is an interesting value proposition. First of all, she just dropped in series, or she will have probably by the time this happens or in the near future after this happens. So having her in the caches feels like a very awkward decision. It does seem like a direct lowering of the value, and I do wonder if they might end up replacing her in the caches. As always, when I do these videos, they're based on the most up-to-the-minute data mines, but even the most up-to-the-minute data mines are not future-proof. So this is something I would keep an eye on to see if they keep X23 in the caches. It is notable to me they just announced that she would be dropping. X23 is mostly, if not entirely, run in Destroy decks, the classic Destroy, Deadpool, Wolverine, Venom, all of that stuff. And that deck, I took a long breath because I was trying to think of a synonym for bad that I could say that wouldn't make all the Destroy players mad. It's not very good. That's as good as I can get for a synonym. This is not a deck that's particularly worth investing in. However, it has remained at the very least quasi-playable basically since this card came out. And that is useful. It is important that this card does contribute meaningfully to that deck. I probably wouldn't play it without that. I'm not sure I'd play it with her, but she is a very important piece thereof. And her being a very important piece thereof does give her some additional value. This is a card that has a home much more clearly than Lady Deathstrike. It's just that that home isn't very good. Next up in the data mines is Peni Parker, perhaps the card that I'm the most excited for this season, although that excitement is not relative to its perceived playability. In terms of perceived playability, I would argue that Rocket and Groot and Doom 2099, in terms of pure power, are likely to be the big pickups this season. Peni Parker just appeals to me as a card that has a lot of different hooks. This is a card that has synergy with merge stuff. It has synergy with decks that create cards. It is also a card that naturally fits in Wiccan decks, giving you a 2 and a 3. There are certain types of hooks for a card like this that are very appealing to me. I think the Wiccan one is going to be a bit of a sleeper, honestly. That's just a really powerful thing to have. Access to a 2-drop that gives you a 3-drop. You're already playing Quicksilver. You just have Wiccan active every time. And the worst case scenario is you have a 6-power mover when you do not even draw the Wiccan, which is something every deck of that nature is interested in, because picking and choosing where your points are allocated is extremely, extremely powerful. I think that this card is quite powerful personally, but more than that, it has so many interesting places to play it that I'm really excited for release week, because it's going to be one of those days where I can do a real video on a bunch of different stuff, and it's going to be really different. Sometimes I do videos on release week cards, and it's like mid-range shell, other mid-range shell, other mid-range shell, and it looks like that, and it's like, that's fine. This card's going to have a lot of different decks, and I'm really excited for that personally, because she has so much possible potential. I think she's going to end up quite strong as well. This is one of the weeks that I would be looking at prioritizing after the other two, just by going by how excited I am for the card itself, the new card coming out. However, there are some other cards in this cache to talk about, and frankly, they are genuinely quite solid as well. Gladiator has received a massive uptick in play as a result of the introduction of Fenris Wolf, with whom he is a perfect pairing. If you recently picked up Fenris Wolf and you do not own Gladiator, first of all, why did you pick up Fenris Wolf? But second of all, this is a really good card to pick up if you are going to plan on doing things like that. The one concern I would have is that there are several Fenris Wolf strategies that are going to be shaken up by the existence of something like Peni Parker. For example, right now, Fenris Wolf is being played in a variety of Wiccan decks. I worry that it's possible Penny supplants him in that role. And of course, in January, Iron Patriot also comes out, possible supplanter there as well. I will say that right now, as of like today, I've been considering various Goon Knight builds with Gladiator instead of Darkhawk, things of that nature to go with your Fenris Wolf more. Really, this card is a good 3 that is competitive with basically every other option on the curve at that point, that has additional synergy with Fenris Wolf that makes it the best 3 in the game to play with that card, basically. It is absolutely phenomenal in that combination, and a fairly reasonable replacement for other premium 3 drops in various situations as well. Many people constantly asking, like, hey, if I don't have speed for this Wiccan deck, what can I play instead? Gladiator's always a great answer for that. He is just generically big, and generically big is always going to have a use, at the very least, as a budget replacement for other more synergy specific generically big stuff like Copycat and Speed in some decks. Gladiator is going to be a great replacement for that, going to be great synergy with Fenris Wolf. This is one of the better cards to be available in these caches. I was actually pretty shocked when they announced that they were dropping Sasquatch, who I think has been a sort of perennially underrated contender. It has basically always been fine to play some form of Gwenpool, Mockingbird, Mysterio, Sasquatch. That has almost never been actively bad, just sort of not necessarily perfect for every metagame. This card is very good in that shell, and I was surprised to see them being willing to drop it in series drops. That took me aback. That really did take me aback. This is a good card. It is very hyper specific. I think at this point we can say this is not a card that goes in bounce most of the time. The only time it was really relevant in bounce was in like the height of Alioth metagame type stuff, where this was a really good way to play around a dominant Alioth deck. But other than that, I have not seen it succeed in bounce shells the way other stuff has succeeded in bounce shells. And since the introduction of Agent Venom and Madam Web giving rise to Move Bounce, which it definitely doesn't go in, I think it's been sort of clear that this is a card that is relegated purely to a deck that plays Mysterio, usually with some other ways of doing Kitty Pryde, Hope Summers type stuff. That's what you'd want to pick this card up for, because she is not really going to go in other stuff. This is sort of a hyper-specific role player in a specific archetype, and that specific archetype has been fine, but not world-beating outside of that tournament that Braude won with it, which is worth mentioning, and I do think is indicative of how a deck with a good mid-range core can just sort of tech right and win against a bunch of stuff, and this is a good mid-range core. Does it compete with what we have now? Will it compete with what's coming out this month? I think that's a little bit more of a loaded question. I think this card is genuinely very good, but the hyper-specificity of her use cases does make her a little bit more awkward as a card you're trying to open for. Next up is Doom 2099, and basically every high-level player I talk to thinks this card is a slam dunk good card. I'm actually a little lower on it compared to other people, but I do think this is going to be a very obviously powerful card, and I think that's pretty clear as to why. You play this card on turn 4, you make a Doom bot. You play a card on turn 5, you make a Doom bot. You play a Dr. Doom on turn 6, you make a Doom bot. It's going to be like 17 power or something like that if you play the Doom. That's just extremely powerful. It's just like a very baseline good thing to do. There's another thing that hooks in with this card that I'm also interested in, and it is the card Zabu. Because the earlier you play this card, the better it is. So there could be a world where, like, playing Zabu Psylocke, this is kind of like the Mr. Negative of its deck type. Here's the thing that limits this card. Board space and total ability to go vertical. That's the one thing that I'm worried about when it comes to this card actually making sense. I find it hard to believe that a deck that plays one card a turn and goes very horizontal and not incredibly vertical is going to be able to contend with something like either normal bounce or move bounce or even Moon Girl, or God forbid the card US Agent. Like, there are some very clear weaknesses here. And so while I do think this card screams relevant in the metagame, I do not think it screams actually unbeatable, going to be the best deck, but I do think it is very likely that when this card comes out, the metagame will revolve around it for at least a short period of time, and it will be an important and major player in the game. I am sort of taken aback that when I was like, hey, they need to buff Dr. Doom, they were like, what if instead of buffing the card everyone has, we sold a card that was a buff to Dr. Doom? I'm not sure they're listening to me, but that is one way to do it, I suppose. I think this card is likely to be strong. I think it is likely to be maybe even overpoweringly so, but I also think it is far from likely to be unbeatable. Just a very good card for those who like curving out. I will note I am assuming here that the Doom bots affect normal Doctor Doom. I think it would be kind of crazy if they didn't, but if that is not the case, feel free to disregard everything I've just said. I'm not sure it ends up making it through. Another thing that this card is really screaming to me is that they're never reverting Sandman. Like, you can't. This card plus Sandman to Doom, that gets rid of all the things that would reasonably beat a deck like this. Everything that would reasonably beat a deck like this is a deck that plays a lot of cards and uses synergy to make those cards go tall vertically in a couple of lanes that it gets to pick. And those decks all play a bunch of cards in the final turn of the game. Sandman would actually make this deck busted. I'm not even sure current Sandman doesn't do that. Like, there's some concern I have for that as well. Like, maybe even current Sandman is enough to obviate these kind of decks from actually beating it. It's a concern to me. And I think that if that does happen, then this deck very much can be the best in the game. But without the ability to play true interaction, it should still be vulnerable to decks like Move that can get on the board early, if not Move Bounce, which will be a little bit more weak to the interaction with current Sandman. I think that this deck will be strong, and it's just a question of how good it's going to be at beating the decks that are targeting it in terms of how long it's going to last as a top-tier metagame pick. The cards they've chosen for this cache could not be worse fits with Doom 2099, to the point that I almost wonder if it's intentional. Like, it's actually a little bit laughable, the degree to which they do not go with 2099, and I think Hitmonkey's like the obvious one here, where it's like, okay, you have one card that wants you to play one card a turn, and then one card that wants you to play a lot of cards per turn. These two never go in the same deck, and in fact, many of the decks that I'm talking about that might be good into Doom 2099 might be Hitmonkey decks. It's just like, okay, I don't really know. Is this like a sell the disease and the cure kind of scenario? What's the plan here? Was these just cards that they had good variants for that they wanted to get in here? Also possible. Hitmonkey's good. Very reasonable card in bounce decks, in Moon Girl decks, and I think those decks are probably, again, likely to take an uptick if you're trying to hard target Doom 2099 stuff. The thing I'd keep an eye on is whether the Sandman stuff is doing a reasonable job keeping them, in check. And if it's not, I think you're going to have a very favored matchup with Hitmonkey decks into Doom 2099 decks. Most of the time, you don't get Sandman. And I think that's a really strong place to be playing from. When you are able to bully snap a deck like that, it's just a very predictable win experience that is usually very cube positive for the deck that can go taller as opposed to the deck that goes wider. Again, worries about Sandman, but that's pretty much it. This could actually be a cache where Hitmonkey becomes more valuable as a result of it. Miek is a replacement level discard card, and there's nothing wrong with being a replacement level discard card. I think people are going to be happy to pick him up if they were already playing a lot of discard, but he's like very much a card that goes in and out of decks. He's not anything that's in any way required to play the deck. He's just pretty okay. You are almost always going to be able to replace him in those decks, and for that reason, I would consider him a pretty poor use of Spotlight Cache resources, if only because you are overwhelmingly likely to be able to play something of similar power that you already have. I'm not saying he's a reason not to open caches, but he's definitely not a reason to open caches. Bruce Banner, if you play him on turn 2 and skip every single turn after that, has about a 69% chance to turn into the Hulk. Frankly, I think people are going to hate this card. One of the things that I like to talk about when discussing Pokemon Pocket versus Marvel Snap is that Pokemon Pocket's RNG is more face up. This allows worse players to determine correctly that they only lost the game because they lost a coin flip, and they can see the percentages on that, and they can know that they were unlucky for it to happen. To my mind, a lot of good game design is hiding the RNG somewhere that worse players might not notice it. And that allows them to have an experience where they can still beat better players when they get lucky, but they won't necessarily notice when they're getting screwed over. And I think there's some balance to this, right? Like, obviously you want RNG in your game. If you're going to do something like this, you're going to want to do it in a weird, unique, swingy way. It's good kind of flavor for Banner, and I really like that it goes with High Evolutionary. I don't know how the player base is going to respond, basically, to the first card in Marvel Snap that actually says roll a dice, right? Like, I don't know how that's going to happen. And I do think that it's possible that the reaction to this card would be wildly negative because of the face-up RNG nature of it. When you skip 4 turns expecting this to happen, you skip an energy on turn 3, 4, 5, and 6, and it doesn't happen, and you know you had a 69% chance to win the game, but you hit that 31%. Fundamentally, humans just aren't good at understanding probabilities. They're just not. And so I worry that forcing a probability into people's faces will create a negative reaction. That said, my instinct is that this card is going to be pretty good. Like, I do worry that maybe there's like some face upness to it where it's like you don't want to snap before it happens, so you snap after it transforms into the Hulk and then they just leave. Things like that are notable, right? But I do think that this is a unique and powerful card. Obviously, has the potential to be a 212. But the thing is, there's kind of a lot of cards that have the potential to be 212s, right? Like look at Thena, for example, yeah? Like this same level of sacrifice is roughly required here, except Thena's output is a little more guaranteed. The difference is what decks they go in. This goes in like a high evolutionary type deck and is a sort of free addition to that, whereas that deck never had access to a 2-drop like Thena that can scale in this way. So I do think, especially as someone who likes high evolutionary, I like it existing, it's one of my favorite cards in the game, I do think this is a good thing to add to that deck. The question is going to be, is that enough to make the deck relevant? And the deck hasn't been relevant in a very long time, in part because of what I can only describe as power creep. When High Evolutionary came out, its cards were better than everything else, or at least some of them were better than everything else at their comparable cost, right? Cyclops as a 3/4 that could scale like that was better than almost every other 3-drop in the game. High Evolutionary Hulk was better than almost every 6-drop in the game. Misty Knight was better than almost every 1-drop in the game. And basically none of that is true now. We have Hydra Bob at 1, we have like Blob and Eliath and Gore at the 6, and we have any number of random 3/5s to 3/8s at the 3, which means that this card is going into a shell that no longer has the competitive advantage that it previously did. And that is worrying. That's not good. You don't want to be in that situation. I hope it works out, but there is something to be said about like, hey, maybe High Evolutionary should just give all of its cards +1 as well at this point. Speaking of High Evolutionary, we kind of just covered everything about him, talking about Bruce because he's such a good fit. I will just say, very good idea to have him in the same cache. If you don't own High Evolutionary, this is a great cache to open, just because you're getting High Evo and the card that almost certainly goes with him. Absolute banger, great job, no notes, honestly, in terms of putting this card here. Great decision to make. Since Gore released, we're in the midst of a bit of what you might call a Ravonna-sance. She's been pretty damn solid in a variety of shells. She's always going to have a home in Mr. Negative, and a lot of these Gore mid-range decks are probably going to try to make use of her as well going into the future. So if those end up managing to keep some staying power, if the versions with her have staying power, it might be a solid idea to invest in her. She's definitely not a bad card. She's sort of like, I would almost describe her as like a jank glue type card. There's a lot of not good decks that get held together by her, and that's a really useful card to have around a lot of the time. It's a very fun card to play with. It lends itself to certain types of things, but it does mean that a lot of the time, unless you're doing, like, she tends to be very clearly paired with, like, Iron Man Mystique. If you're doing those things, she's usually involved, and if you're not doing those things, she's usually not involved, and sometimes she's not even involved when you are doing those things because you're doing Agent Venom instead. And so her dominance over that niche has decreased thanks to Agent Venom, and it is sort of an open question as to whether or not she'll regain it. I think a lot of this is going to be dependent on how much legs those Gore decks have, and if they're still being played at the time this card actually gets into the spotlight caches. If they're dominant parts of the metagame, I think she's a very easy pickup. If not, you have to think a lot harder about it. If you're a diehard negative gamer, just go ahead and get her. Do you remember when I talked about the competitive advantage that Cyclops used to have over other 3-drops and how power creep at the 3 slot has sort of invalidated that? I mean, this card is just emblematic of that. When I first read this card, I thought it just applied a -1, and it was like, oh, okay, you put that to the lane, they're going to fill up. It's awesome. This is so dope. This is a great card. It steals, So this card can be like a 3/11 if it gets 4 procs that can move, which is ridiculous. I think this card is just very, very good. A very competitive at the 3-drop slot kind of card. It'll remain to be seen whether it stacks up to cards like Copycat, cards like, of course, Gladiator. Now the Fenris Wolf is in here. And of course, this card does steal, which means that although it grows, some of its power is locked up in taking away from your opponent, which of course means that Luke Cage does a little bit to obviate this as well. I think this card is likely to end up being at least a competitor for staple 3-drop. It seems quite strong to me, but there is a ton of competition there. And so, depending on what the meta is looking for, you might end up cutting it for like relevant tech like Mobius, or a more specific card that works with your strategy like Gladiator with Fenris Wolf. It really depends on if there's a deck that is just looking for, I would like best in slot 3-drop, and if this card ends up being that. I think it has a real shot. I really do. And I think that it is very emblematic of the issues with High Evolutionary when you compare it to Cyclops. Like, I just don't see how you can look at this and then look at Cyclops and say, yeah, these are, Cyclops is better, right? And that used to be true of nearly every 3-drop. Cyclops High Evo was probably better than it, and that is not true in the slightest of this. I think it is actually probably better than Cyclops High Evo, and I definitely don't think there's any argument for Evo Cyclops being better than this. And that means it's just flat out good, because to me, the bar for 3-drops is as good or better than Evo Cyclops, and that's what you got to do to be best in slot. And that means this card is very competitive for it. Blob is weirdly homeless. And I know that's a weird thing to say about a card that has been so good, but I mean, like, this is like about a year since he's come out. He's been nerfed multiple times since then, so I guess it's not that surprising. But I've seen, like, Arashem decks are typically moving away from him because they need some specific answers to specific things. I'm not sure how permanent that is. I've seen some playing Gore. I'm not sure how permanent that is. Notably, the Thanoshem deck is typically not playing him. He's still good, but he's just like a big 6, and there is more competition for a big generic 6 in the spot than there ever has been before. And there's even more specific competition for like Thanos, a place where this card was once a guaranteed inclusion. Now it has Gore, which is filling the same role and probably a little bit better. And so Blob is weirdly kind of a mediocre card at the time of recording, and I don't really expect that to change just because of increased competition in his niche. And I think this is a functional card, but not one that you're going to actually want to be opening for, to be honest with you. It's not going to really gate you off of playing anything. You can play Arashem without him. You can play Thanos without him. He's pretty good, but he's not make or break for anything right now. This card might be the opposite of make or break. I think she's like probably one of the worst cards in the game. She has very few reasonable synergies, basically pretty much entirely with goblins, annihilists, things of that nature. None of it's very good, and none of it has been very good since she released. Frankly, this is a card that I would look at as like a rework or a drops candidate, to be honest with you. There's really not much else to say about this. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for making it through this video. Someone told me I shouldn't say thank you so much for making it through this video because it sounds like a chore and makes it feel like you're doing me a favor for watching the video instead of like, I don't know. I'll try to figure out something else to say. Thanks so much for watching the whole video. If you want to support the channel, please remember to like and subscribe. Also, if you're looking to support me directly, of course, you can support me on Twitch with Prime subs and on YouTube by watching my videos. But I do have a Metafy linked in the description if you want to be able to contribute more to me. I get a bigger cut of that. Thank you so much. As always, I have been Cam Best. You have been phenomenal and pre-recorded from an undisclosed location where I will be for the next few videos. I hope you have a wonderful Thanksgiving. Have a good one.